Just a quick bit of housekeeping, as Pat calls it. So, for 20 minutes, we will listen to Dr. Ward sharing with us on this topic. Then there will be another 20 minutes where I will pose maybe one or two questions, and there will be further expansion on that. And the last 15 minutes or so, we will open the chat box again for general questions from the attendees. So, thank you very much. Over to you.
So am I answering the questions that Peter sent me? Is that correct, Pelham? Good. So the first question that was asked, and forgive us for the technical difficulties. If it continues, we'll switch to a video I recorded in advance so that you can hear what I had to say. Share some insights as to what you understand the preaching task to be and what this entails for the contemporary preacher. I'll say something very brief there since we already lost some time and we want to get to coaching. Preaching is a complex task, and it's become more complex in the modern era than it has been before. Preaching seeks to send a doxological community into the world through the proclamation of the gospel. That's my brief aim, brief summary of what it tries to do. So it's a missional sending activity. It's not a gathering activity. The gathering has occurred, and we are sending through the proclamation back into the world, hopefully a formed community that is living its life in a way that glorifies God. And that should touch every area of its life, including the justice issues that were mentioned in this last wonderful session. I spend a whole chapter on that, by the way, in my book on preaching in a way that has courageous justice embedded within it. Of course, recent events have caused me to think even more carefully, and I appreciated Kaylee's comments on some of those cares and concerns about worldly importation, but also the qualification to make sure that we don't divide world and church. Very great session. But the complexity of that task has increased with the fact that we no longer preach to a specific context. I was coaching a preacher, I think it was just yesterday in his preaching, and he mentioned casually in our conversation that he had passed one of my sermons that he found that I just recently preached on serving others to 3 other preachers. And they wrote back comments to him. Of course, he was trying to encourage me. But what that reminded me was that my preaching is never for a singular audience. Although I try to focus on the people who I am actually preaching to, I recognize now that also part of my congregation is online, always, even for my own church. And since we have a digital era, my videos are now transferring across contexts continually. So I have to recognize that increased complexity of the preaching task in the contemporary time. Preaching tries to teach, heal, save, and free. We teach people, we give content about the gospel, the doctrine, the kerygma, and how to live. We save. God is the ultimate, of course, agent in all of these things. But our preaching has not only a salvific and an initial soteriological way, but a sanctifying function that's under saving. It heals both spiritually, physically, psychologically, mentally. That's a therapeutic form of preaching, and it frees. We speak about justice and freedom from injustice and oppression. Those are the complex pieces in a very fast summary of what preaching does. So the second question it deals with coaching and mentoring, and these are all related. I think you need both. And what's the difference between coaching and mentoring? Let me just send a quick link. I meant to have this already in the public chat, but let me just put it there for you so that I don't have to explain at length. There's just a quick website there. You're free to open another tab, glance at that, double task of coaching and mentoring from a secular source. It's actually secular language. So there are buzzwords and contemporary practices that come into the church. Peter mentioned to me business and commerce. Is coaching one of them? Well, yes, it is. Coaching is a term that we're borrowing from a secular society. And of course, secular society is borrowing coaching from, in many ways, initially sports environments where you have a coach on the sideline who has perhaps played, perhaps not, but has studied the game and can see you from the outside and give you guidance from an external perspective on what you need to change. Last night, my son had his basketball tryouts for his school team. So at 3:30 in the afternoon, I did a slow-mo video of his shot form and turned it around for him and said, now, what do you see? And he said, well, my left foot is too far back. I said, that's what I saw. But what else do you see? Well, my offhand is underneath the ball instead of side the ball. That's what I saw. What else do you see? Nothing. And I said, well, you're not following through. That's the one thing I saw you didn't see. Your shot. So that is a coaching environment, right? Where I'm trying to help him see from an external perspective what he can't see from inside himself. That's what we are talking about. We talk about coaching in some ways. We import that, yes, but a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. What I read in the epistles in particular is often coaching and mentoring back and forth under the guise of the ongoing pastoral relationship. You might also call it leadership development that Paul is doing with others. These terms from secular theories can help us piece apart what's happening to recognize what's missing. We just have to be careful that we don't corrupt what we do Christianly by what we import that isn't necessarily Christian. I don't want to yell at preachers, like coaches sometimes do. I don't want to act like I'm an expert without areas to grow, like coaches sometimes do. There are dysfunctions that sometimes come with coaching or mentoring, for example, a mentor who feels like they will always be your mentor and can't recognize that we have one teacher. And so my identity is not teacher, it's the spirit that is the teacher. My identity is not mentor or coach. My identity is son of God. And I am a brother I'm a brother to my sister or brother in Christ. And therefore we have that imago Dei that was mentioned by Kaylee, that we have that unity as a result. And therefore I learn in every coaching relationship I have, I learn something new. And if that reciprocity of the gospel isn't there, we have maybe imported something negative that we want to watch out for. That's just speaking briefly about it. How does one go about identifying a coach for the preaching task? Can I just mention prayer briefly? Is that okay? Please pray. Pray about these things. We live a life of prayer. Prayer isn't just something we do. Hopefully, it's something you're doing right now. That inner conduit of your soul is open to the speaking of the Spirit, the presence of God, the enjoyment of God, and the life of God is always flowing in and flowing out of you. We're branches connected to a vine, which means we never disconnect. And I think that includes coaching, praying for that. Now, mentors, of course, more holistic and more informal. A coach usually needs to have an extra level of professional expertise. Here's the difference between often what I see in coaching and mentoring for the preaching thing in particular. It is one thing to know how to tie your shoes. It's another thing to know how to teach it. You should go try to teach a 4-year-old how to tie their shoes sometimes to realize how hard it is to also teach someone how to preach. It's also one thing to know how to teach someone how to tie their shoes your way. It's another thing to know the multiple ways of how you could tie your shoes so that you can help them figure out the easiest way and most fitting way for them to learn it. Is it 2 bunny ears, or is it the rabbit around the tree back into the hole? I don't know if you all use that in your contexts, but there's several different ways of tying shoes. There's more than one way to preach. So a good coach has become well versed in a diversity of preaching contexts and is able to discern multiple contexts, cultures, situations, personalities, temperaments, and therefore step outside of their own way of preaching and see their person who they're coaching's way of preaching and draw out the best in it, which is also true of a good sporting coach, by the way. They don't try to make the player their kind of player. They say, well, your goal on tennis, for example, your golden move is your backhand, not your forehand. Most people have a powerful forehand, but for you, and that was me, maybe I had forehand. Your backhand is incredibly sharp. You've got to play to your backhand. Well, that's a good coach, not trying to make someone in their own image. So look for someone who has a level of expertise and experience that transcends just their own way of preaching. They know how to help others preach, not just preach their own way. If they don't know that yet, they should do more mentoring until they've established that empathy and expertise. Hopefully, they're also someone who has read along the way. That gives them vicarious learning. You asked to share some insights or examples. But I see you reappearing, actually, Peter. I should pause for a second. Does that mean I've already used my 20 minutes? No, keep going.
No, not at all. Not at all. I thought while you're busy with the questions, I'll just sit here and listen in, and at least
Okay,
you have
good.
somebody who responds to what you say. So, no problem.
Okay, good. I forgot to set my timer like I did the last session. I knew what the time was. I don't right now. So let me know, bump back in as we're closing in on that. But some insights and examples of how this coaching enterprise works itself out for the ordinary preacher. So some preachers, of course, are able to pay for a preaching coach. They have the resources in their church because it's well established, it's a larger church, and they're able to pay for a preaching coach who has a higher level of expertise. Someone who has preached broadly, knows multiple levels, has read widely, etc. The old story goes, there was a man who was asked to come fix a machine in a factory. Came into the factory, pulled out his hammer after looking at the machine several times, hit it in one spot, and said, "There, it's working." Left. Sent them a bill for $3,000. The factory owner said, "How in the world are you charging me for $3,000? You came in with one stroke of the hammer. You were gone within 20 minutes." And the person wrote back, "Well, it's really only $50 for that 20 minutes. Is $2,950 for the 30 years of experience I have to know where to place the hammer." So sometimes there's a certain level of expertise that comes. You could have asked somebody else to come and they would have spent 3 weeks and not fixed the machine. But what about the ordinary preacher who can't pay for that? I think it's wise to find experienced preachers who you know have helped multiple preachers along the way, and they have had good track record in being gracious in their feedback, consistent in their presence, and clear in their guidance. When you find someone like that, they're often doing it as a side thing just for fun with people they love, and it has a blend of mentoring and coaching. A friend of mine who does that regularly often calls me. He's a pastor. He's pastored for many years. He planted a very successful church that had multiple church plants come out of it. So he coached those preachers in their preaching, and now people that he loves, that he knows as friends, ask him to coach them in their preaching. So he's doing a great job helping them, and they meet usually once a month, not more than that, to go over one sermon. You can't handle much more than that sometimes, unless you're a really thick-skinned individual. And he just gives them his feedback and guidance and his advice. When he's stuck, he calls me. So when I see his number ring, he says, "I know he's got a preacher he's stuck on, doesn't know how to help him. Usually it takes me 5-10 minutes. I know where to put the hammer." Go bang, right there. I just had a phone call from him Tuesday. I took 5 minutes and I said, "Tell them this." And he said, "Oh my goodness, that's perfect. I was stuck. I didn't know what to do." So there you go. You have a coach who has a mentor, so that it kind of works together in the kingdom of God, that we're all helping one another. So that's an example. I don't know if that's helpful or not. I had my own experience with that. Very young, very young. I asked someone to mentor me, and it turned into preaching coaching. Didn't expect that, but he saw that I had a preaching gift. He was a gifted preacher who had actually taught preaching courses. And I remember one of my first sermons he helped me with. I told him the whole thing that I had written out, what I was planning on, and my introduction was okay. My conclusion was okay. But all he did was give me a little tweak here and a little tweak there that made the introduction sing. It was perfect. He said, "Really settle in on the tension here. Set that conflict up at the beginning, and you'll have them the whole way through, and then make sure you come back to it at the end." And it was about our inequality at the beginning and our equality in God at the end. I still remember the sermon. It gave me a feel of the game of preaching I'd never had before. I didn't pay him. It was a 30-minute conversation. It helped me in ways I wouldn't know how to describe. What would my assessment be of theological training institutions or seminaries with regard to their training and preparation of effective preachers, and in light of needing coaching? We've launched a new seminary. The movement that I've recently joined, called Every Nation, Pelham, has also helped with this seminary called Every Nation Seminary. One of the unique things about this seminary is that every single student receives a preaching coach. And we're working to train all of those preaching coaches in their preaching coaching. We give them regular training components. The students meet 3 times a year with their preaching coach as a part of their curriculum. I don't know any other seminary that's doing that. So you're preaching and you're getting feedback from your peers and your professor, but you're also getting tailor-made coaching for you, your temperament, your personality, your preaching style, your context, your culture, from an experienced preacher as a part of your seminary training. I hope that's a model that, as we dial it in, can multiply among other seminaries. I did not receive enough when I went through my seminary. Not enough coaching. I didn't. I had to struggle to find people and find ways and cobble together books and resources and conferences, and I just needed more help. And if I didn't have very loving, wise, experienced guides nearby that for some reason said yes when I knocked on their door, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. I owe them immense debts of gratitude. So I think we could strengthen that in seminaries and theological training, very practical, practitioner to practitioner help. Finally, how do biblical and/or contextual realities inform the need for coaching in the preaching task? Let me put this very simply. It's part of the reason we need coaching. When you read a book, it's written to a very broad audience. It can't zero in on the particularities of the social justice issues, for example, that we mentioned in the last session, the context, the socioeconomic differences, the cross-cultural dynamics. I have 62 nations of birth origin in my church, 62 nations in which people were born. That's a very unique context. So Sunday we'll be singing in Spanish, but I know that that tomorrow I'm meeting with two different families who are Indian. On Monday, then I'm going to be meeting with a different cultural context, a Nigerian, etc. So the diversity of contexts in the contemporary environment alone says, wouldn't you need some help with that? Couldn't you use some help with that? I was coaching one preacher who's an African-American preacher in the States in the context of the Black Lives Matter really rising that was mentioned in the last session, when a gentleman here was killed by our police force, George Floyd. He was on his yearly vacation, and I contacted him and I said, you have to get back to leading your church. I know you're on your yearly vacation. I would never tell a preacher to cut their vacation short, except right now, cities are going to be burning within the next few days. You have to get back to your church. You have to be ready to preach. You have to know what you're going to say Sunday, and you can't delay anymore. This is going to be a national level crisis. So just because I've had enough experience with that over the years, he had a coaching relationship established, and then I was able to walk him through what not to say, what to say, and his very diverse church made it through without splitting. Many churches had exoduses, major exoduses from their constituency in the middle of that crisis that we experienced in the States. Coaching really helps, and it's an important component. Let me pause there, Peter. I know there's other questions, and I'm probably talking too quickly anyway, because I want to make the best use of the time. But I'll let you ask follow-ups where you think there might need to have clarity.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would actually like you to think a little bit in a minute or two if there's something that's not even listed in these questions that you just feel is really on your heart, that you feel we need to know in coaching, then I would like you to share that. I had an experience where a youth pastor or an assistant pastor started to minister at a church, and in that denomination, the senior pastor would be mentoring and coaching. And then after 3 years, you basically sign off on this assistant pastor and say he's done the internship and all that, and he can now become a senior pastor. Unfortunately, I was often involved with the youth because my children were teenagers. And I had this youth pastor come and preach and do things and teach things that sometimes I had doctrinal issues. Sometimes I just had issues with the way he communicated, and sometimes even broke people down, trying a negative approach to motivation. But the senior pastor was never in sight. And I thought to myself, when 3 years has elapsed, he's going to sign off and say he's done with 3 years. How do we develop that passion as preachers to bring others under our wing and to care enough to mentor and to coach? How do we do it? How do we approach someone if they're not asking for mentoring and coaching, but we're in a position where we could speak into their lives. How do we approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. Let me combine that with something Kaylee's saying in the chat. So in the documents that you'll receive if you ask for them, there is a schedule of the preaching life that I've worked to devise after years of coaching and testing with preachers in different contexts, all over Asia, the Caribbean, Latin America, the United States. So multiple contexts, multiple socioeconomic contexts, and it seems to work with tailor making. You have to tailor make it for yourself. But part of that schedule is meeting with what I call just a preaching group. And I encourage pastors, especially those who are in lead pastor or senior pastor roles, to establish this in their context where they're not preaching alone. One of my little mantras is never preach alone. When you preach alone, you're only developing you, and you only have your little echo chamber, and you don't realize some ways that you actually need some feedback, even though you might be the one normally coaching. And getting them to turn on their preaching mind for you and showing vulnerability for yourself is part of what helps establish that trust, mutual trust with others. And that helps them get that self-conscious self-awareness that they need to grow as a preacher. It also gives you a weekly chance to speak into their lives. So I establish that wherever I can, because that way you have someone that you're speaking with before you preach. That's the ideal, that you bring your study notes, your basic ideas of a sermon, your sermon focus statement, etc., and you brainstorm those and woodshed them together, and then that gives a chance for that context to occur. I do think that if you are a senior leader, you should make your way into every preaching environment that is underneath your care at some point in time, at least twice a year, because that means that way you're giving oversight. What that preacher tells you will be different than what you see. They don't have the self-awareness. So remember the little metaphor of the slow-mo video on my phone with my son. He couldn't see why his shot kept missing. After I showed him that form, he hit three three-pointers in a row, moved a spot, hit three three-pointers in a row, moved a spot, missed one, hit three three-pointers in a row, moved to the next spot, three three-pointers in a row. Now there's his shot. He's a great player, but he was missing half of his shots because of something he couldn't see. So we have to be there to show them. We need someone else speaking into our life, just like Timothy needed to be told, don't let them despise you because of your youth. Titus needed to be told, this is how you treat the older women of your congregation, etc. We need an external viewpoint. Let me just put something also, let me put this in the chat, if you'll give me just a moment, a little thing for you. If you'll send an email to me, I'll put you on this little video series I have. It's a free video series. I'll just send it to you. My assistant will send it to you free of charge. Nothing being sold there. It's just a few videos that help you establish that kind of the structures in your life that we were talking about for your preaching life, but also gives you a training video on how to give constructive feedback. My experience has been most people don't know how to give constructive feedback in a way that builds the preacher up. They either know how to give lots of good compliments, but are scared of hurting the preacher, or they really want to give blunt answers and they're tearing the preacher's ego down without helping them improve. So I have a specific format. My feedback always goes through descriptive affirmations, constructive suggestions, and a final blessing. That every preaching group is structured on, every preaching coaching call is structured on. Some denominations are using that for all of their leadership feedback sessions. Because there's a lot of social science behind it, but it comes down to an Occam's razor of 3 things you do every time. So if you sign up for that there, I'll help you walk through the schedule of preaching, and I'll give you coaching guidance on how to coach, so that as you're leading those in your ministry, you can help them grow in very productive, focused ways.
I live very close to an airport, only maybe 2.5 kilometers away, and it's a training airport. So you have flight schools, and there are times of a day when it is hectic. You can stand in the garden, and you see a plane taking off, another one in the sky, another one turning, and another one landing, and they kind of just go through the loop, landing, taking off, landing, taking off. And I remember my homiletics professor always said, make sure you land the sermon, because this thing of you're almost done and people prepare themselves to get up and leave, and you go for another round. And one particular young preacher was struggling to get the plane landed. So when he stood at the door greeting his congregants, an elderly lady came to him and she said, young man, it was an excellent sermon, but can you tell me, did you actually land the plane or did we crash? Yeah, I hear you when you say we sometimes hesitant to give uplifting uh, comments that are not maybe a compliment, but that can help somebody to just improve in the way they communicate, in the way they come across. I was a very angry preacher when I was 20 years old. I was angry at everybody because of their sin, and why don't you just do what the Bible says? And the Lord has really brought me a long way to have much more compassion and empathy, maybe looking at my own struggle to make it work always. Would you say there's value? You just send us a link to things that we can look at in a series that can help us. Is it valuable maybe to advise young preachers to look at good sermons? Maybe guide them to a few on YouTube or wherever they're available, to say, have a look at this, just like they would do to you, and say, what stands out for you as good communication? What touched your heart and why? Do you have
Yes.
other resources like that that one can use that are safe?
Yeah, I do suggest that. I call it quilt making. I tell young preachers, you're not going to be able to preach your own self free of others. When a preacher stands up, you see the community from which they emerge. So don't get this idea, this privatistic, individualistic, Western ideal. It comes often from the West, in my mind, sense that you need to be your own thing, your own emergent creation that is unique unto the world. No, it's more like making a quilt where you take these historic pieces of others that you see. I like that pattern. I like that pattern. I like that pattern. I like that pattern. And you pull it together into something that's actually you. It's your own self, but none of it came just from you. So I encourage young preachers to listen broadly and to keep a preaching journal. And I tell them they're going to need to start listening to preaching with the left mind, left brain, not just the right brain. Musicians are the only ones who listen to music with their left brain. Everyone else, the brain scan lights up on the holistic, artistic side of the brain, to be overly simplified. Musicians hear the modulations, recognize the decrescendos and diminuendos, the retardandos and everything else, and they see the skill required to make that riff happen in connection with that next piece, etc. And so they're analyzing at the same time as somebody else is just listening to the whole. Preachers have to be that way. We need to become musicians to a degree. We're listening to our art form when we listen to someone else. And so listen to what makes it go well. Why did it make it go well? What didn't go as well as I would like? What would I do differently? And take notes on those. Then I have them do this at the bottom of their journal every time. The bottom of your journal, make sure you write your own spiritual takeaway. At the end, so that you don't corrupt the preaching practice for yourself, return to your right brain and an openness to the Spirit and say, how does this sermon, no matter how good or how bad, impact me right now? Because if the word was read, even if it was just read, the Spirit can speak to me, and I want to give it room to do that. I found that really helps preachers find the diversity. And if they take the ownership of looking for it, they end up finding a better sermon sometimes fitting for them than I would find. I give them a few ideas, but then I say, go find some and then bring them back. We could talk about it when I'm mentoring them. Oh, sorry about that. I kicked the cord. When I'm mentoring them in their early preaching journey. I think that's very helpful. I also sometimes will send them a historical sermon. Say, this is from 300 years ago. Look how differently they preached. But look at the substance. Look at the depth. Look at the passion. Pay attention to the way they use the words. That can give them an imagination, a preaching imagination, they might not have been able to find otherwise.
Sure. Thank you. Very, very helpful, and thank you for that. I think we have another maybe 4 minutes. So if we can open the chat box, if people want to pose their questions so long, if there are questions from the general attendees, but we can, for another 3-4 minutes, maybe share something else that is useful from your experience. I'll just give it, I'll open it for you to just wrap it up in a way that you find suitable. So Yolanda was the first one. Do you see that one?
I do. Yeah, let me just speak to that. Yolanda, great to speak to you from afar, and great to meet part of my spiritual family in Every Nation. You know, by the way, I've joined Every Nation. I'm from the Wesleyan denomination. We have a crossover set of values and systems, and they're not totally the same, though. So let me just mention that I've had many coaches from other denominations. Some of my best mentors were from another tradition. Cleo LaRue was my advisor in doctoral work. He is a Black Baptist preacher from Texas, and he's a dear friend now, dear friend. Even just dreamed about him last night, had this beautiful dream about him. I said, I got to call him today when I woke up and had that dream about Cleo. But he's from a different tradition and has inspired and motivated me and helped me. I don't think it has to be from the same denomination or tradition, but they need to understand your denomination or tradition. If they don't have empathy or concern or value for who you are and where you're placed, you should find somebody else. So they need to recognize the differences of their perspective and context from yours, and be able to speak from within yours, so that they're not alienating you from the tradition you're trying to serve. So that's a danger, by the way, sometimes of seminary education, residential seminary education, when you're extracted, taken to another context, placed there, and then all of your relationships are from a different tradition. Sometimes you find yourself completely alienated. You don't know how to return. And it's important to manage that if that's the situation you're in, to maintain coaching or mentoring or discipling relationships within the context you hope to serve. Otherwise, you become alienated. The next one from Robert: never had a preaching coach, but developed a preaching by genre technique. I would say there's value in that, because we don't want to put a square peg in a round hole, as we say in the States. Sometimes we force fit a form of preaching. Every sermon has to be 3 points in a poem. No, it doesn't. Sometimes you can have an extended narrative or plot based, but you can also preach a linear sermon from a narrative text. I think early on, it's good to match genre with form, but once you become more experienced, you might recognize that the need of the moment actually has your sermon form cross-grain to the genre because of what the people need, but that takes more experience. So early on, yes, preach by genre, try to let the sermon form emerge from the literary genre of the text. What's Tom Long's great book on genres? Well, you'll find it. If you go on Amazon and look that up, you'll find Tom Long has a good book on how to preach the genres of the scriptures. Let's see. Let me just drill down to some things are taught and others are caught. Should that work for preachers who may not have access to a coach? Yes, I think if Augustine said, if you can't learn to preach by preaching, reflecting on it, hearing preaching and reflecting on it, you won't learn to preach. So the first step is really make sure you're getting your reps, listen to other preachers, reflect on it, make sure you have a reflective loop continually, and that you're humble and teachable, as Kaylee mentioned early on. Humility is actually the doorway to preaching growth. Without humility, you're not going to be the kind of preacher you need to be. Then coaching or mentoring is an add-on. But I remember one of the best things I did was stand in front of a piece of glass, a wall-sized glass at night, when the light from the room would be slightly reflective, and I could switch my focus of my eyes to what was outside the window, then to my own reflection. And I practiced preaching in front of that thing many times until I could eliminate some of the really distracting, frustrating mannerisms and ways of acting that I couldn't see unless I could see it live. A coach could have helped me, I suppose, but that continual, automatic, immediate feedback was painful, but so helpful. I was 21, and the hours doing that were very helpful. If you don't have a coach, you can do things like that. You can become your own coach. It's just many people don't have the level of dedication and motivation for that. Thank you, Pelham, for putting the book there. That's so helpful. Preachers who have influenced me the most, I wouldn't have time. I've listened so broadly. I remember the first set that I found was this old video series on VHS. This is, 1998 or something. I don't know. It was 97, 96, 95, somewhere in there. The Great Preachers series that was put out years and years ago. But then, of course, once we got YouTube, I started listening more broadly. But Barbara Brown Taylor at the time, Gardner Taylor, the Dean of Black Preaching, as he was once called. Of course, Haddon Robinson was mentioned before. I listened to him quite a bit when I was younger. But now some of my most influential preachers are completely unknown. You wouldn't even know their names. They're in places where I've bumped into them or helped them. And as I listen to their preaching, I say they're better than the top billing names that are in the conferences. I would listen to them any day. I have my family listen to them. But you wouldn't know who they are. And there's just a large collection of them. I think I need to hear a good sermon. I'm going to go listen to Jeff. I'm going to go find Jeff again. What's he saying this Sunday? I find Jeff and I'd say, there he is again. He just nailed it. Wow, what a great expository preacher. Nobody knows who he is, other than his church, who loves him to death and would die for him gladly, I think, because he's so beloved. Find your own. Find your own. Listen. If you're on the treadmill, listen to a sermon. When you're in a commute, put in your AirPods if you have them, or whatever earbuds you have, or turn your phone on speaker and listen to them. Make use of any of those sort of dead zone times for a while, and you'll find some awful ones. You'll find some fantastic ones, and you can learn from both. Let's see. How do you choose a preaching coach? I think we talked about that a little bit already. Pray. If God brings someone to mind, go ask him. James chapter 1 says, if you ask for wisdom, he'll give it, but don't doubt. Then you're just tossed to and fro like a wind on the waves. So ask for God to bring someone to mind. And when he brings someone to mind, go approach them. If it goes terribly, you can fire them quietly. You say, hey, thanks for your help the last few months. That's really improved. And then just move on. But ask God to help you. Of course, there's professional people who do that professionally, etc. But there's probably people in your life who are more experienced than you at preaching, who have preached in multiple contexts and help others learn to preach. Try to bring those people to mind and ask them, do you have any time? Would you be willing to listen to a sermon of mine? Don't ask them to commit to you forever. Ask them to listen to a sermon of yours. Have that one conversation. If it goes really well, especially if they say, I'd love to do this again if you want to, now you know. If they don't say that, you could ask, would you be willing to do this again sometime for me? How often could we do it? And then you're moving forward.
I did see Pelham post one just now. How do you coach someone who speaks or preaches in a second language, English? How do you come? I mean, you said in your church there's people from 62 nationalities. So how do you bridge that barrier of language when you coach?
Yeah, so for in our context, at times we've had translation on earpieces, we've had other things, but our congregation is primarily an English-speaking congregation, the vast majority, almost all, and those who aren't extremely fluent are trying to become fluent, so they appreciate the English context, although we do switch to validate cultures from time to time in terms of our singing. But I am working with a leader who is his dissertation is going to be on bilingual preaching. He has live translation. And one of his conclusions is that the translator also needs to be very well versed, because if you have a bilingual congregation, the translator is actually preaching. And so they switch back and forth. I know some people who do that, but someone who's speaking in a second language due to the multicultural nature of their congregation, I usually ask them to make sure they've written out their sermon and presented it to a native speaker ahead of Sunday. That helps them extremely to avoid gaffes, mistakes, unrecognized, what we call double entendres. I know that's from a mixture of English and French, but double meaning in an embarrassing way. That's happened for preachers quite often who preach in a second language. The whole congregation is laughing. They have no idea why. And then once it's explained, the color rises on the face. So in that case, I don't always, of course, manuscript preaching is not required, but writing out the manuscript enough that they're able to tell you where your hangups might be, or the colloquialism that you don't realize is specific to your context won't translate. This is how we would say it, is usually a very, very helpful practice. And then if there's a dialect accent, those words are sometimes confused. So let me just use both of them so that you know what I mean. If there is a way of speaking that's hard for others to hear, you have to slow down. You're just going to have to be more focused in what you say, and you're going to have to say less, or say it more tightly, at least, so that they can catch up with their encoding of your speaking. So those are a few things that I say to those I'm coaching in second language contexts.
There's one more question that I see in the chat box. That's a dangerous question. It's asking, how can you as a congregant influence your pastor to go for preaching, coaching, or mentoring?
Oh, yes, this is a dangerous one and a fun one. It's like, oh, with this person, please get some coaching. Well, if you aren't in the eldership, or whatever your structure is, let me put it this way, whatever your church structure is, there should be oversight of that pastor, people who are designated to be oversight and to give feedback to that leader. Now, sometimes that's on governing spiritual principles or budgetary guidelines, don't go into any more debt than X, or here's your primary strategic goal, etc. But that is the window through which that feedback should most appropriately come. So if you are feeling that, don't gossip, of course, to other people in the church, and don't spread the negativity about that. Just go to one of the elders and say, I think our pastor would benefit from coaching. And if you know someone who does that work and is excellent at it, you could mention it to them. And then, of course, suggest they be very diplomatic in the way they bring that up. It's a painful thing to receive that as a preacher. I've done that many times. Some pastors I've coached, of course, the elders were saying, you fix this preaching or we're going to have to make a change. So it was an intervention. And that takes focused, intense work. It's often a difficult time for the preacher, but it's a joyful thing when we've come all the way through that process and their ministry is rescued. I've got a mug in my kitchen cabinet that's covered in birds, and the preacher gave it to me from their home nation handmade mug, and said this was an intervention. And before, my preaching felt it was dying. Now it sings. It's cheesy, but here. So every time I pull out that mug, I rejoice, because we had an intervention with a coach. His elders did have to confront, but then he was humble enough to go through the process, worked so hard, and his preaching is so much better. And we were able to find the blocks that he couldn't find on his own. And now they're rejoicing, all of them together. It's just a wonderful thing to see. But you have to be careful in how you approach it. I don't suggest, unless you are an elder, going to that pastor directly. If you are an elder, I suggest talking with the other elders and coming up with a plan, and then presenting it very diplomatically, starting out with what is good about their ministry and what you're celebrating and why you want it to go even better than it currently is, and the resources you're going to give them. So it doesn't feel like a correction, it's a resourcing. We want to give you a resource and we want to pay for it. We want to care for you.
Thank you very much. It was a very good pastoral approach to it. Just the sensitivity for the person, and they're doing this because they feel called to that ministry, and just the sensitivity around that. Really appreciate it.